He saw 3 luxury cars pull through the iron gates of Cedarwood Memorial Gardens, and the only calculation he made was the one he had made every single day for 16 years. Black faces, expensive cars, Harlow County, his sector, his call. Officer Carl Briggs set down his coffee, got out of the cruiser, and walked across the east lawn of a cemetery toward a permitted, publicly registered, fully documented burial service, and dragged a grieving mother away from her son's open grave in handcuffs while the pastor was still mid-verse. He didn't ask a single question that might have given him an answer he didn't want. He didn't check the Cedarwood Public Burial Registry posted on the county website, where the Tate service was listed for 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. Section 22, Row 7. Permit number HR 2291 filed and approved 9 days prior. He didn't consult his partner. He didn't radio dispatch. He watched 3 luxury cars park in designated cemetery lanes, watched the black families who stepped out of them, walk toward an open grave, and he decided automatic, immediate, the groove worn smooth by 16 years of deciding the same way that something needed correcting. Stick around, because the moment Sergeant Darnell Odom opened that credential wallet and set it on the intake desk, the moment the color left Carl Briggs's face and his fingers went cold around his coffee cup, and his entire 16-year architecture of protection began coming apart at every joint. Simultaneously, a reckoning began that would cost Carl Briggs his badge, his pension, his freedom, and every last inch of the untouchable life he had spent a career constructing. He thought she was nobody. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. Marcus Tate had been 27 years old, and he had designed affordable housing, the way some people compose music, with the understanding that every single choice either opened a door or quietly closed one, and that the people who moved into his buildings had spent most of their lives on the wrong side of closed doors. His firm operated out of a converted row house in Richmond, small by intention. The walls were covered in working blueprints, annotated in his precise architectural hand, with comments in the margins that were equal parts technical instruction and personal philosophy. Wide hallway needs to feel like somewhere, not a corridor between somewheres. South-facing windows in every bedroom, because his mother had told him once when he was 12 years old, and asking why their apartment felt different from the ones his friends lived in, that the quality of morning light in a room tells you everything about who the room was designed for. Front porches on every unit, not because the budget easily accommodated them, but because Marcus believed a porch was a political statement. It said that the person living there had the right to sit outside their own front door and watch the world go by, and that the neighborhood agreed with them. He had been in the middle of a community center project in Fredericksburg when the tractor trailer crossed the center line on a wet November highway. No drugs, no speed. No explanation the universe was willing to provide to the people it left behind. Just the mathematics of a wet road and a drifting vehicle, and a young man in the wrong lane at the wrong moment, carrying 237 completed designs and a lifetime of south-facing windows that would never be drawn. His signature, the thing his colleagues remembered, the thing his clients described when they talked about him, the thing his mother had understood from the time he was a teenager, bringing them home on difficult days, was sunflowers. He brought them to every ribbon cutting, to every client meeting that ran long and ended in something good. To his mother, whenever a day had been hard enough that yellow felt necessary, he said yellow was the only color that couldn't be mistaken for anything but itself. You looked at a sunflower, and there was no ambiguity about what it was announcing. The sunflower spray across the bronze urn at Cedarwood Memorial Gardens had been Lorraine Tate's idea. She had ordered them from the florist in the same way she had done everything in the 34 days since the phone call, with the precise forward-moving intention of a woman who understands that if she stops moving, she may not start again. She ordered them because Marcus would have approved, because yellow was unmistakable, because her son deserved something at his graveside that did not apologize for what it was. She was not the Honorable Lorraine Tate this morning. The title lived in her, the way a professional identity always lives in a person who has worn it long enough, present structural part of the architecture of how she moved through rooms and courtrooms and conversations. 23 years on the federal appellate bench. Hundreds of written opinions. Cases that had reshaped law in ways that moved slowly and quietly. The way water moves through rock, finding cracks, widening them, changing the shape of things that don't know. They're being changed. But this morning, standing at the edge of Section 22 in Cedarwood Memorial Gardens, with her hands clasped in front of her, and her veil down, and the December fog moving unhurried between the headstones, she was not a judge. She was a mother at the edge of her son's grave, and the distance between those two things was absolute and complete. She stood slightly apart from the gathered mourners, not coldly, but in the way that a mother's grief requires its own geometry, wide enough to hold everyone else's loss inside it, which means you cannot stand inside the group if you are also trying to hold the group together from outside. Marcus's college friends were there, 6 of them, driven from as far as Philadelphia and Charlotte, because Marcus had been the kind of person who generated that kind of loyalty without ever trying to. His graduate school colleagues, families from the Fredericksburg Community Center project people who had never met Lorraine, but who had known Marcus through the width of his hallways and the angle of his windows and the front porches he had insisted on. And at the back, arm in arm, Mrs. Adele Porter and Mrs. Ruth Simmons, the 2 elderly women from the block where Lorraine had raised him, who had watched Marcus grow from the boy who fixed their screen doors to the man who put sunflowers in his blueprints. Lorraine wore a plain black wool coat belted, no jewelry except her mother's small pearl earrings, veil down, hands clasped. She was a woman made entirely still by something too large to contain through motion. Pastor Raymond Cole was halfway through the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want in the measured, unhurried cadence of a man who has delivered these words hundreds of times and who understands that what he is offering at a graveside is not sentiment which everyone present already possesses in abundance, but the weight and the rhythm of the language itself. The December fog drifted between the headstones. The bronze urn rested on the chrome lowering device. The sunflowers lay across it, yellow, unmistakable, exactly as Marcus would have wanted. Lorraine kept her eyes on the urn. She heard the boots before she turned. Everyone did. That was what none of them would forget, recounting it later to investigators and attorneys. The sound of those boots crossing the east lawn, heavy and deliberate, and carrying in the cold December air, reaching the gathering before the man wearing them came fully into view. 2 more words from the pastor, then silence. Lorraine did not turn immediately. She kept her eyes on her son. She breathed in. She turned. Carl Briggs walked across the east lawn of Cedarwood Memorial Gardens, with his utility belt creaking and his right hand resting near his holster, and his face wearing the specific expression of a man who has never in 16 years been required to explain himself to anyone he was walking toward. He walked the way he had walked everywhere in Harlow County, like a landlord crossing his own property. He stopped at the edge of the gathering and let his eyes move across it with the inventory sweep of a man performing an assessment he has already completed. The open grave dressed in the way expensive grief gets dressed. Artificial turf concealing the raw December earth. The chrome lowering device, the bronze urn, the sunflower spray, brilliant yellow against the gray morning. The mourners in their dark coats. The pastor with his Bible open. A gathering of people in the middle of the most private thing a human being ever does. This is a restricted area, not loud, but the kind of voice that doesn't need to be loud, because it is by nature of what it represents, the loudest thing in any space it enters. I'm going to need to know who authorized this gathering. The pastor stopped mid-word. The 23rd Psalm dissolved into the December air. One of Marcus's college friends, a young man in a dark overcoat, jaw-tight voice, carefully controlled, said, "Sir, this is a private funeral. There is a burial permit on file with—" "I'll get to you," Briggs said, not looking at him. His eyes had moved to Lorraine. She had turned fully. She looked at his badge first, the number of the department, then his nameplate, then his face. The sequence of a woman who reads situations with the precision of a professional and who has been doing it for a very long time. When she spoke, her voice was level. Not performatively calm. Genuinely calm. The calm of someone who is not afraid and is also not interested in the performance of not being afraid. "Officer Briggs," she said, "this is a permitted private burial. Permit number H, R2291, filed with Harlow County 9 days ago. The service is registered on the Cedarwood public schedule for 10 o'clock this morning. I would ask you respectfully to lower your voice. We are in the middle of a service." Briggs looked at her. He let the look extend past the point where a reasonable man would have reassessed. "What I'm hearing," he said slowly, "the way a man speaks when he has decided that his patience is itself a form of power, is that you'd rather lecture me than answer a simple question." He shifted his weight, let his physical size do what it always did in these moments announce itself. Take up space. Remind the person across from him of the arithmetic of the situation. Everybody's got a reason they belong somewhere. Let's see yours. Lorraine held his gaze for a moment that contained a great deal. "My identification is in my vehicle," she said. "I walked directly from the car to the graveside. I will retrieve it now." She had taken one step toward the cemetery lane, where her car was parked, when Briggs said, "Stay where you are." She stopped. She turned back. Her face shifted not to anger, not to fear, but to the expression of a person who has just had a door closed that should not have been closed, and who is in the seconds following performing a rapid and thorough assessment of the implications. "Officer Briggs." Her voice dropped one register, not raised but deepened, with a quality that anyone who had argued before her court would have recognized as a signal that something important was being said, and that it would not be said twice. "You are making a serious error. I have told you where my identification is, and I am willing to retrieve it. If you prevent me from doing so, and proceed further with this contact, the consequences will be significant, and they will be fully documented." Briggs heard the words. He processed exactly none of their meaning. What he heard, what he always heard, when someone spoke to him in that register, in that tone on his sector road, was a challenge. A black woman at a cemetery in front of witnesses, telling him there would be consequences. In Harlow County, in his sector. The sector he had held the line on for 16 years. "People like you," he said. The phrase worn smooth by repetition, always meaning the same thing, regardless of the noun that followed. Always think they're the exception. He reached out and took her left arm above the elbow. She did not pull away. She did not raise her voice. She stood completely still and allowed Carl Briggs to spin her and snap the handcuffs onto her wrists, and the only thing she said in the same measured and unbroken register she had used throughout was, "I am not resisting. I want that noted, and I want your badge number, 447. Briggs said with the ease of a man who has given out this number before and watched nothing come of it. "File whatever you want, sweetheart. Let me know how that works out for you." The cuffs went on too tight. Joey Garrett, standing 3 paces back, saw the skin at her wrist bones compress the moment the steel closed. He saw her jaw tighten, one involuntary reflex, the body's honest response to pain, and then smooth deliberately back to stillness. He took out his notebook. He wrote the time. Briggs put his hand on Lorraine's shoulder and began steering her away from the grave, past the chrome-lowering device, past the sunflower spray, yellow still there, still unmistakable, resting across her son's urn. Past Pastor Cole, who stood with his Bible still open at the 23rd Psalm, unable to speak, because there are no words written for this particular interruption. Past Marcus's college friends, two of whom had their phones out now and recording hands visibly shaking. Past Mrs. Ruth Simmons, who had her handkerchief pressed to her mouth and whose shoulders were shaking with the particular grief of a woman watching something she has been afraid of her whole life happen to someone she loves. And past Mrs. Adele Porter, who drew herself up and called out Lorraine in a voice that broke on the second syllable, the way a voice breaks when it is trying to carry more weight than a voice was designed to hold. "Step back," Briggs said to her without breaking stride. "Or you're next." Lorraine looked back once. The sunflowers on the urn, yellow against the gray December light. The urn still suspended above the earth. Marcus still waiting, the service not finished, because Carl Briggs had needed someone to be right about, and she had been the nearest available person. She memorized the image. Then she turned forward and walked. The east lawn of Cedarwood to the perimeter road was perhaps 150 yards. It felt much longer. Lorraine walked without stumbling, without rushing, without performing dignity, in any way that was not simply her natural carriage moving through an extraordinary set of circumstances. Wrists cuffed in front of her, black wool coat still belted, veil still down. The posture of a woman who has walked into every difficult room in her professional life with her weight over her feet and her eyes on where she was going. Behind her, the gathering at Marcus's graveside did not move. They stood in the December cold, in the specific immobility of people who have been doing the impossible math of intervention versus survival their entire lives, and who know in the cellular way that experience teaches that the math does not reliably come out in their favor. Two phones recording. Mrs. Simmons, weeping. Mrs. Adele Porter standing with her shoulders squared and her fists closed at her sides and her eyes fixed on the back of Lorraine's coat with an expression built from equal parts fury and love, and the particular helplessness of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize an injustice she cannot stop. In the cruiser, Garrett held the rear door. He did not speak. He kept his face at the careful surface of a man who is working very hard at something underneath it. Lorraine got into the back seat without assistance. She positioned herself upright, not for appearance, but because upright was simply how she occupied every space she had ever been placed in, regardless of what that space was doing to her. Through the rain-streaked rear window, she could still see Section 22, the chrome of the lowering device catching the flat December light, the yellow of the sunflowers, her son's urn, still above the earth, still waiting. She turned away from the window. She looked at the back of Carl Briggs's neck, flushed at the collar, carrying itself with the ease of a man who fully expects to win whatever he has just started, and she began quietly and precisely to catalog. Times, words, the exact sequence of events from the moment the boots hit the gravel path, the specific phrasing of each exchange, the 22 seconds between her first request to retrieve her identification and the moment the handcuffs closed. She built the structure of it the way her son had built his hallways, with care, with generosity for what it would need to hold, and with the complete certainty that it was going to stand. In the passenger seat, Garrett looked at his own hands. Then out the window at the Harlow County roads, wide, tree-lined, maintained to a standard that communicated something about who they were designed for. Then at his hands again. He was thinking about his notebook. The Harlow County precinct smelled of industrial cleaning fluid and old coffee, and the particular staleness of a building maintained for function rather than comfort. The intake area, raised laminate counter-scratched plastic partition fluorescent overhead, was the room where things got processed and filed, and if you knew the right people, quietly made to go away. Briggs walked Lorraine through the main door with the practiced ease of a man completing a routine transaction. Two officers near the water cooler, Tully, and a younger man named Ferris, looked up. They read his entrance the way they always read his entrances, as a performance for which they were the audience. "What did you bring in?" Carl Tully said. "Dangerous trespasser." Briggs steered Lorraine toward the counter without slowing. Refused to ID. Refused a lawful order. Resisted. Cemetery up in the Whitmore sector. The pause before the next line was deliberate, its timing well practiced. You know how it is. The laugh from the water cooler was reflexive. The laugh of people who have laughed at smaller versions of this story, enough times that the laughter requires no thought, no assessment, no consideration of what they are actually laughing at. Sergeant Darnell Odom was behind the raised intake counter. 51 years old, 22 years on the force. He had developed in the way that genuine experience develops things slowly through repetition and consequence. A skill he would describe, if asked, as the difference between assumption and reading. Assumption was what you brought to a situation before you looked at it. Reading was what the situation told you when you were quiet enough to hear it. He had spent 22 years learning the difference, and he considered it the most important professional skill he possessed. He looked at the woman Briggs was steering toward his counter, late 50s, dressed with a quiet precision that had survived being walked across a cemetery in December rain mud at the left cuff of her coat. But the coat itself, the kind of quality that doesn't rumple under pressure. Her wrists were in cuffs. He could see from his position at the elevated counter had been applied too tight, the skin already showing the early bruising of steel against bone with no gap. And she was standing with a posture that in 22 years of booking rooms he had never once encountered. Not defiance, not fear, not the blank, shell-shocked absence of someone who has been here before. She was standing with the posture of someone who was in complete command of what was happening, and was waiting with considerable patience for what was happening to understand this. Her eyes met his. Odom felt the floor drop approximately 6 inches. "Name," he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. "She wouldn't give it," Briggs said, sliding the intake form across the counter. "Book her Jane Doe until she cooperates. Trespassing, refusing a lawful order, resisting." He leaned against the counter with the weight of a man who has placed a package he is glad to be finished carrying. "I'll finish the full report before end of shift." Odom looked at Briggs. He looked at the woman. He looked back at Briggs. "I'll need to hear that from her," he said. Briggs blinked. "Odom, my vehicle is a dark green Mercedes, registered to Lorraine Tate," the woman said in a voice that was clear and even and entirely without performance. The voice of someone who has spent decades making certain that what she says is heard correctly, the first time every time. "It is parked in the Cedarwood guest lane. My credentials are in the glove compartment. I asked Officer Briggs twice to allow me to retrieve them at the scene. He denied both requests. I am requesting now that those credentials be retrieved immediately." A pause. "I am also formally noting that the handcuffs have been applied too tightly, and that I have significant discomfort and some loss of circulation in my left hand." The water cooler area had gone completely quiet. Odom looked at her wrists. He looked at her face. He picked up the intake form and set it back down without writing a single word on it. He looked at Briggs. "Go get the credentials, Carl." Briggs stared at him. "She's being processed. When she cooperates, go get the credentials." Odom's voice did not change in volume or temperature. It was simply the voice of a man who has decided something is going to happen and does not require the room's agreement. Now. Briggs calculated whether this was a challenge worth meeting or a complication worth deferring. He chose deferral. He turned and walked back through the main door, and the room exhaled. Odom reached under the counter for the cuff key. Carl Briggs returned with the credentials, set them on the counter in front of Odom, and because Odom took them without opening them immediately and began making a phone call that Briggs couldn't read, drifted toward the break room where his audience was more reliable. Lieutenant Frank Corley was there refilling his coffee, the settled and certain look of a man who has been protected enough times to mistake protection for a law of nature. 53 years old. The kind of broad-flushed confidence that comes from 16 years of making other people's problems disappear before they required him to have a difficult conversation. He had handled 6 of Briggs's excessive force complaints, 6, and not one of them had resulted in a formal disciplinary finding. He was very good at a very specific kind of work. Briggs told him the cemetery story, the 3 cars, the group, the woman who'd given him lip when he asked a simple question. The way she'd talked all that formal language, all that I formally note and permit number and badge number, like she was running a deposition instead of answering a cop. Corley listened. He sipped his coffee. "You're fine, Carl. She asked for my badge number at the scene. Said there'd be consequences. They always say that." She wasn't scared, Rick. There was something in Briggs's voice that he didn't recognize from himself, a small, unwelcome quality of uncertainty. Most people, they get loud, or they go quiet, or they start crying. She just looked at me like she was taking notes. Corley set his coffee down and looked at Briggs with the patient expression of a man who has talked someone off this particular ledge before and finds the climb tedious. "Carl, I have buried 6 reports with your name on them. 6. Name one time anything has stuck to you." Briggs considered this. The answer was the same it had always been. The Union, Corley. The infrastructure of protection that Harlow County had built around officers like him over 16 years. These things had never failed. There was no reason to believe they would fail now. "You're right," Briggs said, settling back against the counter. "You're right." In the corner of the break room, a younger officer named Greg Paulson was eating a sandwich and looking at nothing in particular. He had heard the intake exchange from across the room before Briggs came in. He had seen the woman at the counter. He had seen with the specific clarity of someone young enough to still be looking the bruising around her cuffs. He thought about saying something. He gave it 4 full seconds. Then he looked back at his sandwich. The intercom crackled. Sergeant Odom requesting Lieutenant Corley to the front desk, immediately. Corley's coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. Darnell Odom had opened the credential wallet the way you open something when you already suspect what it contains, and you want your hands to be perfectly steady when you find out. He set it flat on the counter. He unfolded it. He looked. The federal seal, first gold, embossed on dark leather. The kind of precise, unapologetic detail that communicates exactly what kind of authority it represents and does not expect to be questioned. Below the seal in the credential window, a photograph that matched the woman standing across the counter from him. The woman with the bruised wrists and the mud on her coat and the posture of someone in complete command. A name in crisp official type, and below the name, a title. The Honorable Lorraine Tate, Judge, United States Court of Appeals for the 4th Circuit. Odom set the wallet on the counter with the deliberateness of a man setting down something that might break things if it landed wrong. He looked up at Lorraine. She met his gaze and gave one small, steady nod, not triumphant, not vindicated, containing nothing of "I told you so." The nod of a woman who has been waiting at enormous personal cost for someone in this building to simply look at what was in front of them and see it correctly. Odom picked up the desk phone. He was aware of the 2 officers who had been near the water cooler. He was aware of the intake form with nothing on it. He was aware of the bruising on the wrists of a sitting federal appellate judge who had been handcuffed at her son's burial by one of his department's officers 45 minutes ago. His voice, when Corley answered, came out 2 full registers below its normal pitch. "Lieutenant Corley, front desk, right now." He hung up. He looked at Tully, the one who had laughed, and held the look until Tully found somewhere urgent to be. Then he looked at Lorraine. "I'm going to have the cuffs removed," he said. "I need to make a call. Can I get you anything?" Lorraine said, "Thank you, Sergeant." And it was only the slight additional weight on the word sergeant, the precise acknowledgement of his rank, his professionalism, the distinction he had just made between himself and the man who had brought her here, that acknowledged anything at all. Corley came through the door with his coffee still in his hand, and the practiced expression of a man prepared to smooth something over. He came around the counter. He picked up the credential wallet. He looked at it, and the color left his face not all at once, but in stages the way certainty leaves when it finds out it has been standing on nothing. The shoulders first, then the jaw, then the specific quality in his eyes, which had been carrying 16 years of accumulated confidence, and which were now carrying something that had no name in Corley's vocabulary, because he had spent 16 years ensuring he would never need to name it. He was still holding the wallet when Briggs came through from the break room, following the silence from the front desk, the way you follow a sound you don't recognize, pulled toward it by the specific dread of not knowing, being worse than knowing. Briggs saw Corley's face. He stopped walking. Something in his chest quit, not a skipped beat, but a full, complete cessation, the kind that makes you aware of the absence of your own heartbeat for a fractured second before it lurches back, wrong-rhythmed and too fast. The coffee he'd been carrying was still in his hand. He realized he could no longer feel his fingers wrapped around it. His mouth went dry in the particular way that happens when the body understands something 3 seconds before the mind will allow it to. He looked at the wallet in Corley's hand. He looked at Odom's face. He looked at the woman at the counter, the black wool coat, the mud at the left cuff, the wrist bones where the steel had been, and for the first time in the entire morning, he actually looked at her. Not to assess, not to manage, not to calculate. He looked at her the way you look at something when you have been seeing it wrong this entire time, and the correct version has just arrived and cannot be returned. Lorraine did not move. She did not speak. She met his gaze and held it with an expression that contained nothing he could use. No satisfaction, no anger, no mercy, no cruelty. The expression of a woman who has already made every decision that needs making and is simply waiting for the room to finish catching up. She held it for 5 full seconds. The temperature in the room dropped. Briggs said, his voice coming out wrong. Too high, too much air behind it. The voice of a man whose instrument of authority has just failed him completely. She wasn't carrying ID. She refused to provide her name. Standard contact protocol requires. Corley cut him off. He set the credential wallet on the counter with a careful, deliberate click. He looked at it. He looked at Briggs. And then, in the flat, emptied voice of a man doing arithmetic he desperately wishes he weren't doing, he said, "Carl, you put a federal appellate judge in handcuffs at her son's burial on a public cemetery permit. And then you gave her your badge number and told her to file a complaint." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. Briggs looked at Corley. He looked at him with the expression of a man looking for a lifeline, and finding his lifeline looking back at him with the same expression. Lorraine let the silence breathe for 3 full seconds. Then in the exact same register she had used on the East Lawn level. Unhurried, costing her nothing, she looked at Carl Briggs for the first time since the cruiser and said, "I'd like the name of your union representative, Officer Briggs. You told me to file a complaint. I intend to be very thorough." Odom picked up the desk phone. His voice when the captain answered was the voice of a man who has understood the full dimensions of a catastrophe in approximately 4 seconds and is now navigating it with everything he has. Briggs stood at the intake counter and felt the floor of 16 years begin to give way beneath him, slowly, comprehensively, and without any available exit. Carl Briggs sat in his car in the Harlow County Precinct parking lot for 43 minutes after the end of his shift. He did not start the engine. The December rain had stopped, and the parking lot held the particular quiet of washed asphalt, everything slightly more exposed than it had been an hour ago. The air cleaned of the things that normally gave it texture and warmth. He ran the morning backwards. He ran it forward. He looked at it from every angle available to him, searching for the version in which a procedural technicality existed, in which Corley could reach someone, in which the Union could build a wall around him, the way it had always built walls. Every version arrived at the same place. The Cedarwood Burial Registry, public record, time-stamped showing the Tate service at 10 o'clock, with permit number HR 2291 printed in official county type. His own body camera footage, which he had not thought to check, because in 16 years, nothing he had done in the field had ever required him to remember to check it. The 22 seconds between her first credential request and the handcuffs, 22 seconds that his own camera had time-stamped in the corner of the frame. The cuff marks documented by whatever physician she had seen in the hours since her release. 11 witnesses who were not defendants or known quantities, or people who could be persuaded toward a different account. They were a federal judge's son's friends and colleagues, and 2 elderly women from her block who would describe what they saw with the clarity and the patience of people who have been waiting their entire adult lives for their account to be taken seriously. He reached for his phone. He called Corley. 4 rings. Voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He drove home through the Harlow County roads, wide tree-lined. The lawns set back at a distance that communicated insulation from consequences. And he sat at his kitchen table with the overhead light on and his duty belt still buckled. And he understood piece by piece, with the slow and terrible precision of a man who has no one left to call exactly what he had done. He had driven to a cemetery on a Wednesday morning and handed a sitting federal judge the most airtight civil rights case in the history of Harlow County. He had given her his badge number. He had told her to let him know how it worked out for her. He lay on top of his bed, with his eyes open and the ceiling above him, and did not sleep. She was released at 2:17 in the afternoon. A lieutenant she had not seen before came to the intake desk and spoke to her in the careful, over-precise language of a man who is managing a situation he does not yet fully understand and is terrified of compounding. She listened to his apologies. She accepted the return of her credentials and her purse. She requested and received the incident number, the intake form, with nothing written on it, and the formal notation of Briggs's badge number, which she already had, but which she asked for anyway, so that the asking would be on the record. She drove back to Cedarwood Memorial Gardens. The burial party was long gone. The December light was thinning toward dusk, the east lawn empty except for a groundskeeper moving between sections in the gray distance. She parked in the guest lane and walked across the grass to section 22, row 7. The grave was closed. Pastor Cole had returned on his own 20 minutes after the cruiser left, returned without being asked, with the quiet determination of a man of faith who understood that a service interrupted by injustice is still a service that needs finishing, and had completed the burial for whoever remained, lowering the urn himself, because the funeral director had also gone, and it seemed wrong to let Marcus wait any longer in the December cold. The sunflower spray was still there. Rain flattened slightly, but there. Yellow against the headstone that bore her son's name, and the 2 dates that no mathematics of fairness could explain. Lorraine stood at the grave for a long time. She was alone in the way that a mother is alone with a child, even in the complete absence of other people with an access to that specific person and that specific grief that she did not allow herself in any other company. She spoke to him quietly. She told him what had happened, not softening any of it, because Marcus had never needed anything softened. She told him she was sorry the service had been interrupted. She told him the sunflowers had stayed. Then she rolled up her left sleeve. 2 bands of darkening skin at the level of her wrist bone. Not deep yet. The deepest bruising would come overnight. Her physician would note as the capillary damage worked its way to the surface, but present and specific and measurable. The marks of steel applied against bone with deliberate force at her son's graveside in a public cemetery on a Wednesday morning. She looked at them the way she looked at everything she needed to understand, without addition, without subtraction, seeing the thing itself. She rolled her sleeve back down. She took out her phone and called her law clerk. Sandra, I need the name of the best civil rights attorney in the Fourth Circuit who doesn't have a case before my court. I need it by tomorrow morning. A pause. Judge Tate, are you? I'm fine. The voice of a woman who is not entirely fine, and who is also in a more important sense entirely fine. Tomorrow morning. She stood at Marcus's grave a little while longer, the sunflowers holding their yellow against the fading December light. Then she got in her car and drove home. Joey Garrett, 25 years old, sat at his kitchen table at 11:30 that night with his personal notebook open and a pen in his hand. He had joined the force 3 years ago because he had believed with the specific untested sincerity of someone who hasn't had a belief properly examined yet that law enforcement was a service. He was still in the process of finding out what it was. He wrote what Briggs had said on the drive to Cedarwood that morning, the exact words reconstructed as precisely as he could. You know what the problem is with this sector, Garrett. Nobody holds the line anymore. People show up where they don't belong, and nobody says anything because nobody wants the trouble. Somebody has to be the standard. That's why they put me here. He wrote that he had asked what Briggs meant by where they don't belong, and that Briggs had looked at him with the patient expression of a man who has been asked an obvious question and turned back to the window without fully answering. He wrote the timeline. 9:48. Briggs exits the cruiser. No radio contact, no registry check, no partner consultation. 9:53. First credential statement by the subject. Clear and audible. 9:54. Second credential statement. Clear and audible. 9:55. Handcuff application. He wrote the exact phrasing of both statements reconstructed from memory. He wrote the specific words of the arrest people, like you always think they're the exception, because they had a particular texture that he knew would not leave him. He wrote what he had seen at the intake desk, the color and location of the bruising on both wrists, the distance he had been standing close enough to see clearly in the fluorescent light, the moment she'd given Odom that small, precise nod when he set the wallet down. He looked at what he had written for a long time. He thought about Corley's voice in the break room. Nothing sticks to you, Carl. You know that, and the way it had sounded like a promise that the person making it believed completely. He thought about the two officers near the water cooler who had laughed before they knew what they were laughing at. He thought about the pastor standing with his Bible open and no words coming out. He thought about the woman at the intake counter and what it cost. He could see what it cost. It was there, in the specific quality of her stillness, to stand in that room, the way she stood, and to wait, and to give that one quiet nod. He closed the notebook. He picked up his phone. He looked up the number for the FBI field office in Richmond. He set the phone down. He picked it up again. He dialed. Lorraine Tate filed the formal federal civil rights complaint 71 hours after her release. It was 11 pages single-spaced in the precise legal language of someone who has read 10,000 complaints over 23 years and who is for the first time writing one. She wrote it herself at her desk, before her clerk arrived in the early hours of the morning, because there are some things you cannot give to someone else. The complaint named 3 respondents. Officer Carl Briggs, badge 447. Lieutenant Frank Corley, Internal Affairs, and Harlow County, Virginia, as a municipality with a documented pattern of failure to supervise and discipline. It was filed under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, Deprivation of Rights, under color of law, with a supplemental claim under the Fourth Amendment for unreasonable seizure and excessive force. Attached the body camera footage obtained through an emergency records request, filed within hours of her release. The Cedarwood Public Burial Registry, the incident number and intake form. Photographs of her wrists taken that evening by her physician with clinical measurements of the bruising at both wrist bones. And 11 signed witness statements from Marcus's college friends, from his colleagues, from Mrs. Adele Porter and Mrs. Ruth Simmons, each describing the same sequence of events from a different position on the East Lawn, arriving at the same facts through 11 different pairs of eyes. The FBI Civil Rights Division opened an investigation within 6 days. The certified letter arrived at Briggs's home address on a Tuesday. He signed for it himself. Corley retained private counsel within 48 hours of the FBI notification and stopped returning Briggs's calls. The walls of protection did not fall dramatically. They simply ceased to be maintained, which accomplished the same thing. The union representative called Briggs on the 8th day. His voice, for the first time in 16 years of calls, did not have the sound of reassurance. It had the sound of a man reading from a document that contained things he had not prepared himself for. "Carl," he said, "you're going to need to find private representation." On advice given before Corley stopped taking his calls, Briggs submitted his incident report. 3 days late, a procedural violation time-stamped by the FBI before anyone had read a word of the content. The report described Lorraine as combative and non-compliant from initial contact. It described the handcuffing as a standard compliance measure employed after extended non-compliance. It used the word extended. The body camera showed 22 seconds. The FBI's comparative analysis of the report against the footage dismantled it in 4 specific places, with the efficiency of a document that does not need to raise its voice. The failure to check the public registry. The 2 credential statements, clear, audible, time-stamped, contradicting, refused to provide any identifying information. The cuff application at 22 seconds, contradicting extended non-compliance. And the characterization of Lorraine's formal legal language as an implied verbal threat, a characterization that everyone on the investigative team, most of whom had spent careers in courtrooms, recognized as a description of a statutory notice, not a threat. Corley's private attorney, reading the comparative analysis on a Thursday afternoon, quietly began drafting a cooperation agreement without informing Briggs. This was the second domino. Joey Garrett walked into the FBI field office in Richmond on a Friday morning with his personal notebook under his arm. He spoke for 2 hours and 50 minutes. He asked for nothing. The union called Briggs on Friday afternoon and told him to find his own lawyer. Federal investigators building the background file requested professional records for both Lorraine Tate and as material to the incident. Her son, whose death was the documented reason for her presence at Cedarwood on December 4th. What they found in Marcus Tate's professional record was a body of work that no one had asked for and that no one could set aside once they had seen it. 237 completed architectural designs. 41 built projects, affordable housing, all of them in communities across Virginia and North Carolina and Maryland that had been underbuilt and overpriced for decades. Buildings with south-facing windows in every bedroom. Wide hallways designed to feel like somewhere, rather than a passageway between somewheres. Front porches on every unit, because the architect had believed that a porch was a political statement, and he had put that belief in writing in his project notes, and the project notes were in the file. A photograph had surfaced from a Richmond newspaper, Marcus, at the ribbon cutting of his Fredericksburg Community Center 18 months before the accident, standing at the entrance in a dark coat with the ease of a person who has done the thing they were meant to do. And behind him in the entry courtyard, in large ceramic planters flanking the main doors, sunflowers. His design signature, written into the first draft of the blueprint and unchanged through every revision. Sandra Reeves found the photograph. She put it in the prosecution narrative file without comment, but it's shaped in the way that a thing shapes every sentence written in its presence, without being named in any of them, the quality of attention that the government's case would carry into the courtroom. Lorraine received the full investigative file as the complainant. She read it methodically as she read every file with the complete professional attention of a person trained to see things accurately. She went through the timeline, the comparative analysis, the witness statements, the medical documentation. Then she reached the photograph of Marcus at the ribbon cutting the sunflowers behind him, yellow in the courtyard light, and she stopped. She sat very still for a long time. Then she closed the folder. She opened the next one. She kept working. The federal courthouse in Richmond was full from before the doors opened. The line extended down the courthouse steps and around the block by 7:30 in the morning. Press. Legal observers from 3 law schools' notebooks already open. Community members from the Fredericksburg neighborhood, where Marcus's community center stood, with its sunflower courtyard from Harlow County, where 16 years of Carl Briggs had accumulated, in the way that things accumulate when no one is required to address them, from as far as Charlotte and Baltimore people who had driven, because this case had moved in the months since December from a news event into something that felt like a public question being formally required to answer itself. The question, who does the law protect and who does it get used against? Federal District Judge William Harmon presided 19 years on the bench, a reputation built on patience and absolute zero tolerance for evasion, the kind of judge that careful prosecutors aimed for and careful defense attorneys calculated around very carefully. Carl Briggs sat at the defense table in civilian clothes. His attorney's strategy, the logic of making him appear smaller, less institutional, less like what the record said he was. He had lost weight in the months since December. His face had the quality of a man who has not slept well in a long time. He looked at the table when the gallery filled. Sandra Reeves stood at the government's podium and looked at the jury for a moment before she said a word. Then she said, "A mother came to bury her son. She had a permit. The burial was registered on the public cemetery schedule. She walked from her car to the graveside with her hands free, because that is how you come to bury your son." An officer drove up. He saw 3 luxury cars and black families, and he made the only calculation he had made every day for 16 years. He did not check the registry. He did not consult his partner. He did not ask a single question that might have given him an answer that contradicted the decision he had already made before he finished his coffee. He took a mother from her son's open grave in handcuffs. The handcuffs were applied too tight. The bruising was documented by a physician that evening. Everything that follows in this proceeding is the record of that decision and its consequences. She sat down. 9 minutes. The body camera footage played on a screen large enough for the back row to read the timestamp in the corner, 29 minutes and 41 seconds in full, without edit or interruption. The gallery watched in the silence of people who know exactly what is coming and find that knowing does not make the watching easier. The moment Pastor Cole's voice cut off mid-verse was audible in the gallery. When the audio captured Lorraine's first credential statement, clear, formal, complete, at 9:53 a.m., and the footage then showed the handcuffs closing at 9:55:14, a sound moved through the room. Not quite audible. Entirely present. Briggs at the defense table looked at the table throughout. Joey Garrett took the stand on the second day in his full uniform, pressed the night before, with the attention of someone who understands that how you arrive somewhere tells the room something about what you think is required of you. He was 25 years old. He opened his personal notebook on the stand, and when Sandra Reeves asked him to describe the morning of December 4th, he read from it in the flat, precise voice of someone giving a factual account of facts he recorded at the time. He read what Briggs said on the drive to Cedarwood. He read the timeline with time stamps. He read both of Lorraine's credential statements, reconstructed verbatim. He read his description of the handcuff application and his observation of the bruising at the intake desk, the color, the location, the distance he had been standing, which was close enough to see clearly in fluorescent light. The gallery was very quiet. The defense attorney stood and asked Garrett in the tone of a man who is not confident in his question, but must ask something, whether he understood what he was doing, whether he understood what testifying against a fellow officer meant in practice for a career in law enforcement. Garrett looked at the attorney. "I understand what my job is," he said. "My job is to the law, not to the person standing next to me. A sound moved through the gallery, that not quite audible presence, the weight of a room holding something and beginning carefully to put it down. In the third row, an elderly woman pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. Not grief exactly. Something more complicated. Lorraine at the complainant's table did not look at Garrett. She looked at the middle distance with her hands folded, the same stillness as the graveside, as the intake counter, as every room she had ever walked into correctly. She was holding the whole thing as she had held it from the beginning. From outside it, so it didn't consume her. Carl Briggs took the stand on the third morning. His attorney walked him through the account slowly. The approach, the contact, the arrest. Briggs used the language of his incident report. Non-compliant. Combative, refused repeated lawful commands. He said the words with less conviction than he had written them, because he had now sat in this courtroom for 2 full days, and heard his own body camera audio, and watched Garrett read from his notebook, and had a very precise sense of exactly how much ground remained between his version and the record. Sandra Reeves stood up. She did not hurry. She stood at the podium and took a moment to organize her papers, and the moment was deliberate, the kind of pause that gives a jury and a gallery time to look at a man and let what they already know about him settle. Then she said, "Officer Briggs, your report states that the subject was combative from initial contact. I'd like to play the body camera footage from 9:48 a.m. to 9:53 a.m. and ask you to point out the combative behavior." The footage played. Briggs crossing the east lawn. The gathering at the graveside. His own voice. "This is a restricted area," interrupting the psalm. Lorraine turning, looking at his badge, speaking, her voice clear and level. The permit number, the public registry, the request to lower his voice. Reeves paused the footage. "Where is the combative behavior?" The tone was, "I'm going to play the portion from 9:53. Lorraine's voice again filling the courtroom. "My vehicle is a dark green Mercedes registered to Lorraine Tate. My credentials are in the glove compartment. I asked Officer Briggs twice to allow me to retrieve them." Reeves let it finish. "Is that a refusal to provide identification?" She didn't present physical. Reeves held up the body camera still. The timestamp 9:55:14. Lorraine's wrist bones. The handcuff application. This image is time-stamped 22 seconds after her second credential statement. In those 22 seconds, what did she do that constituted non-compliance? The defense attorney's pen had stopped moving 2 questions ago. Briggs looked at the photograph. He looked at the timestamp. He looked at the jury, and found in their faces nothing that was going to help him. "She didn't retrieve her identification," he said, and even he could hear how it sounded in the room. Reeves set the photograph down. "Because you told her to stay where she was." She did not phrase it as a question. No further questions. The jury was out for 4 hours and 11 minutes. When the foreman stood, a woman in her 40s, who had taken careful notes throughout in a small spiral notebook she'd brought every day, she delivered the finding in the clear, settled voice of someone who has had sufficient time to be certain. Guilty. Violation of civil rights under color of law. Guilty. Excessive force. Guilty. False arrest. Guilty. Falsification of a police incident report. Each count read separately. Each landing in the gallery with its own weight, and by the 4th one, the room was no longer holding the silence it had been holding. It was releasing something slowly and carefully, the way you release something you have been carrying with both hands for a very long time. Corley, who had entered a cooperation agreement 3 months before trial, received a reduced charge. He lost his pension, his rank, his union protection, and 32 years in Harlow County law enforcement. He would spend the remainder of his professional life in the obscurity of a man who made himself useful in exchange for not being fully held to account for what he enabled. Briggs received 4 years in federal custody, permanent forfeiture of his law enforcement pension, permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification in the state of Virginia. The sentencing judge noted for the record that the violation had occurred at a permitted documented private burial, that the subject had made 2 formal requests to retrieve her identification that were denied, and that the bruising documented by her physician that evening was the direct consequence of deliberate force applied at a graveside. When the 4th guilty was read, Lorraine Tate did not stand up. She did not turn to the gallery. She sat very still in her chair at the complainant's table, the same quality of stillness as the east lawn, as the intake counter, as every room she had moved through correctly for 23 years. And she breathed. 1 full breath in and out deliberately. She unclenched her hands, which she had not realized until that moment she had been holding closed. She looked at the case file folder in front of her at the number on the tab, and she let the verdict be exactly and only what it was. The cuff marks on Lorraine Tate's wrists took 11 weeks to fade completely. By the time the last faint discoloration at her left wrist bone smoothed back into ordinary skin, Harlow County had signed a federal consent decree mandating independent civilian oversight of all use-of-force incidents, permanent body camera requirements, with mandatory retention schedules and an independent review process for internal affairs findings that bypassed the department entirely. 3 months after the decree, the Virginia State Legislature, citing Tate versus County of Harlow as controlling authority, passed mandatory body camera legislation for every county law enforcement agency in the state. The bill was signed into law on a Tuesday morning, and the attorney who drafted the key provisions noted in her remarks that the case had prevailed, not because of legal complexity, but because the record had been complete. A body camera that kept running, a notebook filled at a kitchen table at 11:30 at night, a burial registry on a public website, a physician's photographs taken the same evening. Clarity, in the end, was the thing that no amount of institutional protection could outlast. Joey Garrett resigned from the Harlow County Police Department the week after the verdict. He enrolled in law school at the University of Maryland the following fall, concentrating in civil rights and constitutional law. He wrote Lorraine a letter 8 months after the verdict, 2 handwritten pages, asking for nothing, describing only what he had seen and what it had cost him to sit with, and what he had eventually decided to do with the weight of it. Lorraine read it twice. She wrote back on a single page in the small, precise handwriting of a woman who says exactly what she means, and nothing beyond it. The Marcus Tate Foundation for Civil Justice opened on Clement Street 18 months after the verdict, staffed by attorneys who had read the full case file, who had seen the body camera footage, and the notebook entries, and the photograph of Marcus at the Fredericksburg ribbon cutting with his sunflowers in the courtyard, and who understood, in the way Marcus had understood about buildings, that the whole point was to give people space they had never been given before. In its first year, the foundation handled 58 cases, secured dismissals or reversals in 39 of them, and twice produced appellate language that was cited by the state legislature in subsequent legislation. Lorraine returned to Cedarwood one morning in early spring, alone carrying sunflowers. The December mud on the east lawn was long gone. The grass had come back green and unhurried. Section 22, row 7, had the settled quiet of a grave that has been tended and returned to and understood. She stood at Marcus's headstone for a long time without speaking. She had already said everything at the grave in December, and in the courtroom, and in the foundation's charter, and in the 431 cases she had decided from the bench in the 14 months since each one read, with the same full attention, now carrying something additional she had never had a name for, except that it was the weight of a sunflower spray on a bronze urn in December, rain, and the sound of boots on gravel, and the particular quality of stillness that is not absence, but is instead the decision made at a graveside, at an intake counter in a federal courtroom, at a kitchen desk at 5 in the morning, to remain exactly who you are, regardless of what the room is doing. She placed the sunflowers against the headstone, yellow, unmistakable, impossible to confuse for anything but what they were. She stood there until she was ready. Then she got in her car, drove back to the courthouse, went up to her chambers, sat down at her desk, and opened the next file. She began to read. If this story of a mother's unbreakable dignity and the justice that found its way back to her moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe our channel so you never miss another story about people who refuse to be broken. And tell us in the comments, did Briggs deserve 4 years? Or was that too light for what he did at that graveside? We read every single one. Next week, a hotel manager bans a black veteran from the lobby bar, unaware he's about to check in as the new regional vice president of the entire chain. You do not want to miss it.